Welcome back to another episode of the LifeSci AI the podcast series. And this is series 3, and we are halfway through almost series 3. And we're really thankful to be joined by the CEO and founder, Alex Menys of Motilent. Was practicing that before because my northern twang doesn't quite get it right, so I'll let him have the proper pronunciation. But I've known Alex for a long time, so I'm really grateful to have him on. He has some really interesting ideas around software as medical devices, around IBS and Crohn's disease, and he's going to share the story of himself and how he went from professor to founder to successful CEO now. So welcome, Alex.
Greetings, Nick. Thank you so much for having me on today. And it's a pleasure. I've listened to the podcast now for quite a long time, stimulated mainly by recognizing a few of the names on there over the years. And I think it's now, feels real good to be alongside some of these people.
Awesome. And the name, because I said, I've got a northern twang, and sometimes I do, my pronunciation goes awfully wrong sometimes on this podcast. So just explain how it came about and why you chose Motilent.
Yeah, so picking a name for your company is the first great existential problem you face when founding a company. And, I work in digestive diseases, and I did my PhD in examining the gut with MRI. And just in case that wasn't niche enough already, my specific thesis was around bowel wall motion and what you call motility or peristalsis of the gut. So the first part of the company's name is based on motility. And we're only going to go deep from here, everyone. I'm sorry in advance, but enterography is the preparation of the bowel when you're examining it with imaging. So you drink this fluid, it distends the bowel so you can see it nicely. You can see if there's any disease, and that's called enterography. So the company name is essentially a portmanteau of those two words, motility and enterography, called Motilent. And the first time I explained that to an investor, they basically glazed over and gave up. And I knew right then that was going to have a very long, hard future in entrepreneurship. But 8 years later, I'm still here kind of pushing on. So I think that speaks more to my stubbornness than the greatness of the name. But there's one other slight concern around picking company name. And that isn't that it's an offensive or rude word in another language. So off to Urban Dictionary to check it thoroughly to make sure it doesn't show up in some other kind of terrible meaning. But it was all clear, especially at the time that I picked it. So here we are today. So it's Motilent.
Motilent, yeah. Well, it's an interesting one, and a topic actually we've never really covered on the podcast. Naming your company, So was there any second choices or the front runners that you had, or?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, especially now recording this podcast here in 2022, the company has moved a lot since I named it. Back then, we were looking at this very niche process within the GI tract. And now I look about what we're going to talk today on, which is the entirety of digestive disease, Crohn's disease management in general. And it's gone far beyond just motility or MRI or any one test. And it's a much more holistic business now. So I think as you ask this, I'm actively reconsidering what the company is called. I mean, I'm not going to change it just yet. I mean, it'll be a lot of documentation to update. But, I think increasingly I'm beginning to reevaluate what that means to me, the company, and what we do going forward. But there's no need to kind of get worried, I think, just yet. And I'm still very happy with it and its various different pronunciations.
Yeah, that gives me a free pass to go back to my Yorkshire twang for the rest of it. So talk to us a little about yourself, because we were chatting just before we came online, and you're only the second CEO that we've had and founder on the podcast series so far. Obviously Tim Gwilliams from Helix. So talk to us a little bit about your story, why you went from professor to CEO of a really niche area of medicine.
No, so just in full disclosure, I didn't go from professor to CEO. Right. I think what happened was I did a PhD, and during that PhD, I started what was essentially a consultancy, and that's how we originated. And essentially what I was doing was so not complex because it was hard, complex because I really did a bad job of writing software and knowing how to run anything. But clinicians wanted to use the technology we had. And it wasn't so much that I was doing anything magical here. I was just helping them with that work. And I ended up getting written to grants and various other projects. And that's where Motilent started originally. Now, it is really, really hard to get a faculty position these days in academia anywhere. I think as if you follow social media, you'll know that academics are leaving academia in their droves due to the lack of job security and all the rest of it. And I was no different, really. Despite having lots of publications and all that kind of stuff for my PhD, which I'm really proud of, it didn't really translate into a job or job security. So what I ended up doing was leaving academia. I kept the company ticking along, and I was furiously writing grants. And to a degree, I was quite successful. And a lot of that money came straight back into the main institution I worked with, University College London. And so despite leaving, I got made an honorary associate professor. So it's a little bit less impressive, but nonetheless, for some of the contributions to the kind of the academic infrastructure there. So now I walk around with my CEOship, and I do enjoy and cling jealously to my honorary associate professorship at UCL, and I try to give back still to the various academics and stuff that are coming through that system. And I still have a lot of passion and interest in the academic piece of the work, and I think that comes through in our social media. Is very educational focused.
Yeah.
And I think the more novel the area that you're doing, the more of an emphasis you have to place on education. And I think that teaching role, I think, will always be very strong in me, both as a CEO, but also in general. I think in passing that information on is key. So that's the kind of the backstory really around all of that.
So an accidental founder, would you say, or was it like each small step became logical, and now you're on a podcast 8 years on?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bit of that. And I think some people set out and want to become a CEO. Some have CEOship thrust upon them. And I think for me, being a CEO is sort of, not a big deal. But being in charge of your own ship and kind of moving towards the objective that you have, which for me is literally changing the way we see the gut. I feel that having a small company and a team of great people is the perfect way to kind of get that pushed forward. In another era, I might have been working at a hospital or in a lab somewhere or within a big company. But right now, I think this is just right for the type of thing that we're doing.
Okay. And where were you in 2014? What was the technology that was either, you could call it a buzzword or such, because you were obviously in the imaging space around the gut, but you were talking about software that you were programming and such. So it would have been a different world to the one we obviously live in now. But how different was it back then?
Well, AI has been around forever, but I think machine learning and neural networks were beginning to kind of come into fashion. But there was a lot of more just basic, what you call math on images going on. So registration, which is the alignment of features in image space, was very popular. Segmentation was a very established field already, which is where you'd find mathematical methods to extract some structure. And if I'm perfectly honest, I think a lot of good companies still use these techniques because they're very easy to verify and validate. They're quite sophisticated to develop. And I think this move towards, CNNs and TensorFlow has in some ways degraded some of the science that went on back in the day. All that science is now wrapped up into a black box. Yeah. But back in 2014 and before, when I was working on these areas, it was incredible just how much had been done with what you call more simple kind of mathematical methods to look at images. And the field was very, very sophisticated. And I think the real precursor to AI was texture analysis, which really took off around then, where you were looking at the histogram of pixels and looking for signal that you couldn't really see with the naked eye, but would show up in histogram analysis. And that was really getting quite popular. And around that time, I joined the board of a AIM-listed company to provide some scientific advice. And I think that company called Feedback PLC, which has now been it turned into something that's looking rather successful, a bit outside of the image analysis space. They were really doing what I think went on to become AI. But of course, the AI swell didn't really happen until 2018, 2019, I think, when people started raising serious money. And I think now we've kind of come over that peak, and we're heading towards the kind of either the trough or maybe the plateau of productivity. But we're someplace after all that now. And I think I've seen that whole kind of swell, and I've been paddling along through all of that. We at Motilent, we use AI as a means to an end. It's used mainly in our validation tools and some of the other work that we do. Yeah. But we still try to cling to a lot of the old ways because A, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah. I think B, when it comes to the regulatory side of things, there's no need to overcomplicate things, and AI should really be a last resort if you can't find a more, simple way of doing it. And I think that's kind of how I've seen things shift. And my outlook hasn't changed, but I think certainly the world has kind of spun around a few times. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a comment around AI that's so common.
but it was almost 3-4 years ago. If you had AI in your name or you had .ai, you can kind of add an extra zero from the investors. So everyone kind of tried to take a hammer to a pane of glass, when all you didn't need that to clean the glass, right? You just needed a bit of polish for it. So I'm glad that you've kept on what has worked for you. But when we've always spoken, that hasn't always been the biggest challenge that you guys have faced. It's almost been the educating about the clinical need, and you mentioned about the education piece being really, really important to you. So how's that expanded, and where do you sit now on what the clinical need is for your work?
Well, I think there is our specific use case, but there is a general framework that for me it fits into. And people that know me know that I bore them a lot with this kind of topic. But within MedTech, you've got therapeutic MedTech and the diagnostic and monitoring type MedTech. So therapeutics like hip implants. So a lot of the AI stuff fits into the diagnostic and monitoring. And then within diagnostic and monitoring, you've got Me Too type products that do something that we already do quicker, faster, more efficiently. So a good example is the bone age in the hand. So you can do an X-ray of the hand and you can look at the carpals and say, well, it's, you know, this age. And you can do that with an old lookup table, or an AI can do that for you. And I think in that case, you've got a very kind of clear reason for doing it, a way to sell it, an audience that needs it. And I think the thing is, you know, fundamentally, it's an efficiency tool. I think the other more challenging area is on the novel biomarker development, which is where a lot of people, and we personally fit into, if I'm honest, like we're trying to develop a new way of looking at a chronic disease that is very challenging. And I think when people are developing into this space, I mean, we'll get into regulations and talk about that all day, but I think the regulatory barrier isn't so much of a problem because you can't really contextualize the risk and people don't know why it does or doesn't matter at that exact time. You might say it's got this impact, but it's not a clinical test today. And I think you can get market clearance, but then you've got to really go and convince the community why they're going to move away from their standard way of doing things, the existing clinical care charts and the flow diagrams that they follow. And they've got to learn a whole new way of looking at some particular disease through the context of your new marker that you've produced with your, in air quotes, AI. And I think that just really makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. I think if they're busy, you can't just change one part of the care algorithm and expect the whole thing to make sense. You've got to potentially re-envisage a lot of that care algorithm. And I think all of this, you know, ties into kind of what makes things very, very difficult for all of us. And you look at very established areas like, for example, cancer screening programs. That's been around forever. There's now about 8 different companies that are all doing like mammography reads. And you're asking them to stop doing what they've done and kind of slightly adjust the way you might scan mammography. And I think you can make an efficiency play on the one hand, but missing anything there is really, really bad for a lot of people. And there's a lot of work to be done on how do we re-envisage a care pathway that, for example, incorporated some mammography type AI tool. And I think that bit, it's destined to happen, and there's no way it won't happen. But to expect people just to shift overnight, I think has been quite disappointing for a lot of the investors in this space. And I think we've all made a bit of a misassessment, perhaps, of how long it's going to take for these no-brainer type decisions to actually fully come through and be valuable. And nowhere is this worse than what I call chronic diseases that don't kill you. And we're jumping around a little bit here, but there's a thread of reason that I'm sure you'll be able to unpick, Nick, for me in a minute. But if we look at very successful companies in this space, people want to know, how is it going to change outcomes and what's it doing for me? And I think to know that, you have to be able to measure the outcome quickly. So in stroke, for example, there's been some riotously successful and wonderful companies that have been working on stroke triage because the outcomes are so close to being measured. And now I finally get to answering some of your question. We work in inflammatory bowel disease, and no one really, touch wood, dies from Crohn's disease that often. They just live a really, really horrible life. And saying, how's this change patient management? That could be 5 to 10 years away, when after years of mismanagement, they go for surgery and have a stoma and then have it reversed. And they're way outside of your care horizon at that point. So it makes making that kind of very justified argument for exactly how you're going to change care management in a time frame that we recognise in most hospitals excruciatingly challenging and difficult. And I think that's why, you know, there's a range of different problems. When you're in novel areas of chronic disease, and the consequences of you mismanaging patients isn't as obvious as it needs to be to kind of force change, I think you find yourself in a very challenging position to develop a company. And you've got to really take a long view, dig in, and really work hard on the education, the support, and the training that goes with your tool, and focus on that care pathway 2.0 rather than just trying to buff something that doesn't necessarily work that well today.
Yeah. And you mentioned it, like the care pathway 2.0. Do you think that not only if you have something that's very immediate to measure, so talk about stroke, or talk about emergency care if someone has a heart attack, of sort of where the missed bump is, but with your care pathway, not only is the measurement quite far ahead, but also there's a lot of different stakeholders involved in that as well. So you haven't really got one person with one pain point, i.e. one clinician. You've got to talk, educate, and understand a number of different people across. If you had one patient going through the pathway, they're going to be talking to so many different people, engaging with so many different people. So I reckon that is also probably, on layman's terms, makes it, take it away from the clinical point of view, I would find that damn challenging as well.
No, that's absolutely right. So just to give everyone some context, Crohn's disease is one half of inflammatory bowel disease. This is chronic inflammation of the gut. You can't cure it. I mean, you can cure ulcerative colitis, which is the other half, by removing the colon completely. These patients are on anti-inflammatory drugs for most of their lives. They'll be on surgery occasionally, and they just have a very diminished quality of life. And they're separate from irritable bowel syndrome, which is the more functional side of GI problems that don't have a visible cause. And inflammatory bowel disease affects nearly 250,000 people here in the UK. And I think people with this disease consume 2 to 3 of the top 10 most expensive drugs used in the NHS. So it's incredibly expensive. And every single drug company has at least one asset for managing inflammation in IBD. So you may not have heard of it, or you might not really have heard of it, but it's a massive healthcare problem.
Yeah.
So that's just some quick background on that. Perhaps we should have gone in there sooner. But going back onto the point here, each patient will be managed by surgeons, nutritionists, dietitians, of course, gastroenterologists, radiologists, IBD nurses, stoma nurses, you name it. So you've really got to get all of these people around a table and say, look, this is the direction of travel, and we've got to go there together. And I think the reason Motilent has taken quite a long time to kind of get to where we are today is because we've got to recruit a lot of these healthcare professionals along the way and get them seeing things from our perspective. And most of them inherently agree with it, but it's difficult to affect change in hospitals. And I don't expect that to be easy for anyone. Yeah,
no, it's difficult to affect change, and it's even more challenging. You can kind of someone should definitely do an equation to figure out the multiplier for how challenging it would be every time you add a different stakeholder into a clinical pathway. I'm sure someone
square law there, I think.
Yeah, someone on a weekend can do that. Doesn't matter about EBITDA anymore. It's about your multiplier for investors. It's about the multiplier for healthcare change. That's the one each company should look at. But where you guys are now, though, so you've kind of set out the challenges. So it's not all pessimistic. There is change to be had, and you are doing some incredible stuff, and you have achieved a lot as well in that time. So you have a product and you have a platform, right? And you've also got some really good regulatory approval, both in the UK and in America, to shout about as well.
Yeah, so let's just quick. Yeah, I mean, it's good to kind of clarify this because it's evolved a lot even in the last couple of years. So if you wanted to summarize what Motilent's doing now, it's right patient, right treatment, right time in inflammatory bowel disease. So it's about the precision care pathway in IBD. And we've expanded far beyond just doing MRI. We work a lot with ultrasound and increasingly endoscopy and capsule endoscopy to really capture the entire care pathway, to spot the early disease when it flares up, to really characterize how badly the disease is doing, and then watch it get better. And ideally as less invasively as we can do it, and as remotely as we can do it as well. And the main tool that we have that's moving that along is our platform, and the platform's called Entralytics. Again, playing on the enteric nervous system, which is like the
you and your names.
Brain that runs through our gut.
You and your names.
You've got to come up with a name for these things. Need a logo as well, but we'll get around to that at some point. But Enterolytics has got nearly 300 plus clinical users on it now. Radiologists, gastroenterologists, surgeons, you name it, doing lots of different projects around the digestive system, and most of them in inflammatory bowel disease. Enterolytics itself is not market cleared, but it's used by a number of research institutions, most of the top ones in the space, in fact, as well as increasingly pharmaceutical companies that are running their own R&D type projects on that platform. So it's really the hub for people getting to know what our tech is and us discovering what those user needs are. And then from that platform, we can take the best evidenced tools within that platform and start market clearing them. And the tool that we've got FDA cleared recently is called GI Quant, and this has been available in Europe now for adults and kids for some time. And this measures the amount of Crohn's disease activity in the small intestine. So you can't get to the small intestine that easily with endoscopy, especially if the person's got obstruction in the bowel from inflammatory bowel disease. So you will use MRI in these cases most of the time anyway. MRI is a very powerful technique, but it's quite subjective. And GI Quant allows a radiologist or a trained clinician to extract a numerical score for how severe that disease is. The person can then go on the drugs to treat that inflammation, and they can come back and have that score checked up on. Now, the key point here, I guess, that we need to make is, in America, for example, that person will have a follow-up MRI in 12 months, and we know that 60% of patients are probably going to stop having, seeing the effects of those drugs at 12 months, 60%, in fact.
Right.
Lose response. And those drugs are expensive. They cost $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 per patient year. So there's a big waste of money. And if the drugs aren't working, the disease can be getting worse. And when I say worse, I'm talking about really nasty stuff, like the bowel will start to get stuck together. You'll develop fistulae and potentially other complications that'll need you to have surgery, a stoma. And it's really horrible thing when you're, like, for example, in your young 20s, you're supposed to be at university doing something else. You don't want to get it wrong. And I think this is the problem. Now, the person's not going to die, but they're going to have a really terrible life because of it. And I think this is why I care about this area.
Yeah.
So what GI Quant can help a radiologist do is spot that failure sooner. If the GI Quant score is going down or staying the same, the drug is not working. And we've recently had results from Cincinnati Children's Hospital that show that we can spot that change in 6 weeks. So very, very early on. And you can either give the gastroenterologist the confidence to kind of keep pushing on, or to make an important change at a key time. Now, the tech works. Our big battlefront at the moment is, what's the gastro going to do with that information? And I think that our big battlefront, as I'm saying, is really getting into those gastro clinics now and supporting those clinicians make changes based on our data. And that's a huge leap of faith that people have to take. And I'm hugely sympathetic for anyone wrapped up in my various trials and schemes and other plans, I think, in this space. And we're doing a lot of high-level research studies that's going to be very interesting to see, based on working out how we can re-envisage that aspect of the care pathway. But again, the recruitment, the trials, the ethics, the funding, all of this stuff takes a very long time to pull together. And people need to go together in lockstep and make sure they're really doing it together, as opposed to one part of the business getting out of its way and overhyping some aspects. That isn't true.
So is it almost, you've got the platform as a gateway, I guess you could imagine it as, into your major product at the moment. And that the GI Quant is 6 weeks. You said it was it can identify the difference, when it's sometimes it can take 12 months in America.
Well, I think we can see evidence of change with our test. The numerical scores change as early as 6 weeks.
Right.
In America, because of reimbursement and other reasons, the MRI is not done for 12 months, just because it's very hard to read without tools to assist. And it's not seen as just a way of doing things. In Europe, we actually scan a bit earlier. I think there's 6-month scanning happening at some points, and we're a bit tighter with that. But it fits into a bunch of different money and cultural differences, especially because endoscopy is much preferred in the US. So they'll always go for endoscopy first instead of cross-sectional imaging. And I think this extends far beyond just our technology, but this is also kind of how we go about looking at this complex disease. It's not sorted out just yet, and I think there's still a lot of work to do.
Just to sort of explore the difference between then America and UK and Europe, because had this discussion with IDENS and sort of the difference between American healthcare and UK healthcare, especially when going into medical imaging. You mentioned two key differences there around scanning and around endoscopies. So how different is it for you? And do you think it's more different than other industries, other care pathways for you?
I think every care pathway has unique challenges that it faces. I think one of the big issues in chronic disease especially is that people are getting paid for doing certain procedures. And I think if you're upsetting the apple cart when it comes to people's reimbursement, I think it's difficult. And fundamentally, if your insurer doesn't cover an MRI at 6 weeks, and trust me, none of them do, I think it's very difficult to get pre-approval for that scan. And then the patient's ending up having to pay out of pocket for it. And I think that's just not something that we are used to here in the UK. That's not how things work.
Yeah.
But you're just introducing huge problems for the patient as well as everyone else. And on top of that, if the clinician then doesn't know exactly what they're doing with the results of that data, then you're not really helping a lot. So you've got to kind of go in with the eyes wide open to the US and work out exactly who you're benefiting, why and when. Yeah. Now, there are some caveats around this, and extraordinary clinical claims do require extraordinary clinical evidence. And I think if you can put that data together and just show this 10x increase in the way that we're looking at a patient group, especially the academic institutions will get behind you and start pushing it. And a good example is prostate cancer. I can remember 10 years ago with the PROMISE study at UCL, the thought of doing a prostate MR ahead of biopsy was like ridiculous, misuse of money. What were we going to do? MRs for every man, ridiculous. It's not going to happen. Now everyone's doing prostate MR because it is the right thing to do for the patient. It's the right thing to try and locate that lesion and be much more specific with the template, than the template biopsy, and just go for the area of interest. And to this end, we've really focused very hard on pediatric inflammatory bowel disease. Generally, you don't want to have to scope kids more than you need to. Scoping an adult is different. The risk is lower, and a whole range of different factors make it a lot more doable to scope adults. Scoping children repeatedly is just not a particularly nice thing to do, nor a good idea, nor that useful, especially in that physiology. So we've really, we ensured that our FDA labeling included pediatric uses, and we've really focused, for example, where the maximum effect size of what we're doing can be seen. Kids respond very quickly to medication, so it makes sense to have more scans. And the insurers know that if they mess it up with that kid and they have short bowel by the age of 20 and they need to go on like central feeding and all this stuff, they're looking at hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per year to look after that patient. And they definitely don't want that to happen. So there are certain levers that you can really kind of organize your business around to really show that impact as early and quickly as possible. I think that's really where we've spent a lot of time and thinking. And on the face of it, it's harder from a regulatory perspective. It's harder to get your studies going, but the effect is so much bigger that it's a good entry point. And I don't know if it's a particularly novel thought, but young people tend to carry their testing and their management care pathways with them through time. If they're accustomed to having an MRI, quick ultrasound, and they're getting capsular endoscopy in the community once a year to make sure they are in remission at the age of 14, they're going to expect that at the age of 17, and they're going to demand it at the age of 20. And I think if you invest in these people young, you can hopefully have them pull it up as they kind of go forward. I think I'm very satisfied with that approach currently.
Yeah, definitely a long-term play then. In what you're looking at. But you mentioned you mentioned prostates, the difference in screening there as well. So looking at other sort of MedTech companies and software as medical devices, you mentioned stroke as well, some really cool companies in that space. Won't name any names, but both two have been on this podcast series before. But where do you see the challenges now of software as medical devices when it comes to MedTech?
I think software as medical device needs to get off its high horse as something special. It isn't. You're just producing numbers, telemetry, or information that goes into decision making by a clinician that's going to do something or not do something. It's no different from C-reactive protein, a blood test for inflammation, or a screening questionnaire, or anything else. And again, if you're copying something that already exists, people are going to get it. If you're coming up with an AI version of C-reactive protein and it's been verified and validated to give you the same number, you can have less issues with getting that accepted because people are going to be substituting one tool for another. I suspect most clinicians don't know if their CRP test has been swapped over in the lab somewhere. They just kind of get the number back in EPR and carry on. We have to face the reality of the fact that a lot of AI solutions, especially if they're products that output some number or some score, are destined to face a similar type of role in a care pathway. They're going to be embedded. There's going to be some math happening behind the scenes, and they're going to spit out a number that goes into a flow chart that if higher than this, then this, else that. And really that simplifies the problem because, you know, the regulatory system tends to sort itself out if you're seeing these tools as like a blood test or similar. But you know, the big risk is how much you charge for these things is going to be impacted. And I think if you're making your money from just doing a single number, you will find there's a degree of attrition. It's only a matter of time to the OEMs like GE, Philips, and Siemens stick it on their system and call it a day. And then it's a real race to the bottom, making it as cheap as possible. And I think this is the one dark path that I think is destined to be a reality. And it was already happened with calcium scoring, for example, in medical imaging. That would have been branded a fancy AI company if it was founded in 2019. It happened years ago, and now it's just a feature on the GE and Siemens and Philips systems. But a lot of clever entrepreneurs, would like to consider myself there, have seen that it's not enough just to output a number. You need to wrap a care pathway, re-envisage that care pathway, and provide a proper solution. And you know, a lot of people say, well, is your test validated? It's like, that's not the question. It's, is the complete solution validated when it comes to outcome? You can't expect sticking one good component in a car and the whole car to be 10x better. You need to replace all the bits probably. And I think that's really what we're looking at with the future of what we're doing. Less and less companies I'm seeing now are trying to make a single tiny piece work better. They're really looking at the whole care pathway and thinking, how can we do this better? And we're doing that too. We've got the platform. And it's only a matter of time till you can run that entire Crohn's disease patient's care plan off of our platform with all the different tools. The AI make it slick, objective, quick, and better. But it's the system that it's all and the substrate that it's set into that's really going to be the value add, because we're going to be able to prove this patient's doing better if they're on our, you know, in our pathway, compared to the kind of the existing clinical standard, which is spread around a bunch of different hospitals getting variable standards of care from different centers everywhere. So I think we're going to see much more an evolution in mindset away from just doing a product into a solution. I think when we've got the solution locked down, we're going to see transformative changes in healthcare and outcomes for patients in simple diseases. Stroke's not simple, but it's in the acute and well-researched, well-funded, and well-understood part. There's, you know, diabetes is sort of chronic, but getting into the right place. But, you know, the future of medicine is necessarily hard. You're going to be looking at long-term cancer management where you're knocking out certain genes and trying to keep on top of it. It's being diagnosed, but then it'll be managed. You're going to be looking at other more chronic diseases like IBS, for example, where people are missing loads of work from it in GI, and a whole range of other GI problems that can be multifactorial. And the solution is going to have to be a platform type approach to that disease area. And I think that's where the AI is going to be really kind of pulled together and used to kind of assist with all of that. And I think that's just unbelievably exciting. And I think that's what we should all be looking to try and build or build into at least.
But the amount of platforms that are coming available now, and we're having discussions around platforms rather than products, is the biggest shift that I've seen really in the last 18 to 24 months. But I think just to maybe fight the corner of people who are looking at one whole solution right now and have a product and an IP around a product. Half the problem can be that a lot of people see their technology and think we could use that in our clinical pathway and we could use that in our clinical pathway. So they almost kind of have way too much, too many fingers in too many pies almost, but because there's been a clinical need for all of those things based on the technology and the work that they've done. So what would your advice be to people who are considering or having discussions with different areas of pathways and other pharma or biotechs coming to them and saying we could use that for that clinical trial or that R&D and such?
Well, I mean, I think this is wonderful. So an example for us is we started at looking at the small intestine getting inflamed in Crohn's disease, but the University of Nottingham have kicked off this entire program in cystic fibrosis, where the new drugs for CF, Kaftrio, mean that people don't now die early on in life, and they live long enough for GI problems now become the main thing that people really get stuck with. And you get this compaction of mucus in the GI tract, and it shows up looking awful like Crohn's disease. And they've found this whole application for our technology in that space. And what do I say to that? I don't change the business plan. I say, great, we're providing a tool here. If you can find uses for it, then absolutely go for it. I think when it comes to running a business, and this is with my CEO hat on here, though, it's that focus is it's very sporadic and unforeseeable. And cystic fibrosis, whilst I'm utterly delighted that we've got, we can impact that area, the market's fairly small and it's very difficult to know exactly what to do with that. And it's the kind of thing you take to shareholders if you're a listed company and the share price would dip because they didn't see the monetary value in it. And I think if you're going to opportunistically acquire new disease areas, I think it's great, but you've got to be thinking of the narrative, like how does this fit into the kind of the North Star of your company? And if you're making a vertical business like ours, where is this helping someone with a gut problem? It makes it easy to say yes and no to these applications. You fold it in. And if you're doing a horizontal business, like an app store for different AIs, I think, similarly, it's quite easy to kind of see where that fits in, but you've got to make sure that you're putting the right type of tools in and not going vertical when you should be going horizontal or vice versa. And I think that's probably how I'd contextualize it, but it's a really case by case type problem.
Yeah.
And wherever you find someone that's desperate to use your tool for something new, I think it's always best to kind of let them get on with it. Say that's not the, make sure you comply with your information for users and regulatory requirements. But everything that we have in medicine these days has come from people messing about with stuff in the first place and seeing what happened. And that's how medicine has come to be. And I'm a massive supporter of that continuing.
Oh, for sure. And as an entrepreneur then, within MedTech, and what's, I guess, the negativity of what is out there to come, right? We're getting feedback from investors and VCs and such, and the macroeconomics that we're facing in the world right now, as we're kind of facing cost of living crisis, COVID pinch, supply chain issues, semiconductor issues across the world. What does a founder need to focus on?
Well, on the plus side, with crypto going down, at least GPUs are now quite cheap. So that's silver linings and all of that. For me, innovation in medical, and especially MedTech, and going back to especially the diagnostic and monitoring MedTech, where so much of your value comes from real world usage. This is actually quite a fantastic time and an opportunity to really think about what you're doing, realize, the markets, we're in July at the moment. The markets are going down. We're probably going into recession. I mean, that being said, I'm sure America will just start printing more money and we'll be in another massive boom time for inexplicable reasons. But I digress.
There's an election coming, so they probably will do.
Yeah, let's get the printer back on, shall we? I think when you're making this kind of fiddly type of technology, you don't really need massive pots of cash. Massive pots of cash allows you to hire very expensive people and to kind of try and push delicate clinical decisions with money. And I don't think that necessarily kind of gets you there quicker. I think it can accelerate some things. But if I was starting out what I'm doing now, I think with a relatively quiet market, there is still a lot of cash there to be raised, as long as you can, take a bit of a hit on the valuation, and not try to compare yourself to how you were in 2019. And then think about it from an investor's point of view, you can't really put this money elsewhere. The interest rates are still low. It's very difficult to put it in the market. So there's cash and there's dry powder that's sitting around. So the question is, well, how do we get hold of it? And when you've done a fairly more modest round than you might have done 3 years ago, there is a whole bunch of trials and real world type work that you can start putting together with a very modest budget to prove how this test might be working. You can speak to more clinicians, and you can really kind of take your time, I think, to realize a high quality, fit of what you're doing. People talk about product market fit in medical and clinical. That is completely wrong. There is product market reluctant acceptance, which is where clinicians grudgingly start using your tool because everyone else is doing it. And I think this is, a down market, I suspect, is actually quite a good time to have those slower conversations and not be pressured by this spectre of having to deploy 20 million and there being this competition from everyone else. I think this is actually quite a good thing for medical, especially knowing now what we know about how to regulate and how to push these things through. So I think it's actually a glorious time. I'm quite happy to be solvent at this particular time, to touch wood, for the moment at least. And I expect to see a lot of really good, high quality medtech coming out over the next few years. And I'm very keen to help other people along the way if I can.
Well, there's you mentioned regulatory and how much more improved we are. And we've not even touched on that, and we're coming to the end now. But I just want to say thank you, because it's been insightful. It's raced along this episode, and you have some interesting topics. That's always a point of chat. And whenever we have a call, it's normally 2 minutes, but it lasts about half an hour, because we do try and put the world to rights sometimes. Most of the content is driven by you, to be fair, because I don't really bring much to the party. But you're on a mission, and it's one that is getting through, absolutely. And the success that you guys have had, and I guess the organic success and the right type of success that you've had, is a testament to the business that you've created, and should be an exciting 12, 18, 24 months for you guys coming up, right?
No, I think so. We are currently hiring quite extensively, which is interesting, and it's great to see so much wonderful people on the market looking for interesting work. I've worked hard to create a stapleship, and I think I've resisted going out and raising cash, for example, before we really need to do it. And I think this is something that I'm actively looking at now, just because it turns out you can't bootstrap an American market access team completely out of your own. So there's various different, but
they're quite expensive.
Yeah, it turns out they are. I think what's going on in America, it's probably that money printer. But we spent a long time kind of positioning to where we are now, and I think we're set for quite a healthy amount of growth. And I think there's quite a lot to come and learn from us. So I think if anyone's interested and has listened to this podcast and wants to chat as an entrepreneur, wants to kind of follow up on this as an investor, not necessarily to invest in us, although you might want to, but just to kind of triage some of the information out there, I'm always happy to kind of talk. And I think if you're a clinician or someone that is thinking about sidestepping out of just doing the clinical work, I've been stunned by how many people come to me from clinical backgrounds and just don't know what the jobs are in this space. And I've had a few conversations like that in the house. So I could sell it out to anyone that's curious. But it should be fun. And I'm generally known for being a bit cynical, but it's tongue-in-cheek cynicism, because I think medicine is rightfully hard. And if it wasn't hard, a lot more people would be dead. So I'm kind of glad that it's that way. And it's something we should kind of revel in and joke about together. I think when things seem a bit unfair, and I'm always kind of keen for that. And I don't want to gloss it for anyone, but exciting times ahead. And I really appreciate having the time to have a bit of a chat.
No worries.
And I hope that the audience can extract some value from this, otherwise slightly chaotic.
No worries. I think the quote of the episode was there. If it wasn't hard, there'll be a lot of people dead. Medicine in a phrase. Thank you very much for coming on, Alex. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening, guys, as well.
Thank you.